Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi everyone, welcome to an in-between episode where I answer any question that you have about history. Today's question comes from listener Liam. And here is the question.
What did entertainment do to the Romans?
Well, thank you very much. What did entertainment do to the Romans? This question about entertainment in the Roman Empire has led to a famous concept called bread and circuses, or bread and games, from Latin panem et circenses, although some classicists have told me that the C is always hard in Latin and it should be pronounced circenses. It's a shorthand for a superficial means of appeasement. And political analysts and others have used this phrase of bread and circuses to describe the generation of public approval, not through actually providing the goods that the public needs for its own welfare, but through diversion and distraction. And this is something that goes back to the Roman Empire, and it wasn't identified by later historians, but by poets of the time. Its originator, Juvenal, used the phrase to describe the selfishness of common people and the neglect of wider concerns. And it wasn't just the politicians trying to pacify the public, much like in the book Brave New World, where soma is a drug used to dull people's senses and accept the oppressive government over them, but the people themselves gladly accepted it. Well, Rome was 8.5 centuries old when the poet, Juvenal, wrote his famous tirade against his denigrate countrymen. He wrote in approximately 100 AD, "Now that no one buys our votes, the public has long since cast off its cares. The people that once bestowed commands, consulships, legions, and all else, now meddles no more and longs eagerly for just two things, bread and circuses." And 40 years later, the Roman historian Fronto echoed the charge in a more prosaic use of language. Roman people is absorbed by two things above all others, its food supplies and its shows. So according to this poet and this historian, this is a once proud people who rules a vast empire and whose government had been their servant, who'd finally succumbed to the growth of political power, and a people who had relinquished their sovereignty to government administrators whom they had granted absolute powers in return for food and entertainment. And what later historians would do when they quote this poet and this historian is argue that the Romans themselves understood the slow destruction of their empire by corruption that would eventually change into a government that was so bloated and so inefficient that it couldn't even defend itself against barbarian invasions in the 400s, that the Roman Empire of its glory days would easily be able to put down. Here, Juvenal makes reference of bread and circuses to the Roman practice of providing free wheat to Roman citizens, as well as the costly circus games and other forms of entertainment as a means of gaining political power. This grain dole, the annona, was begun under the instigation of the politician Gracchus in 123 BC, and it was an object of political contention until it was taken under the control of the autocratic Roman emperors. Okay, so why did they talk about bread and circuses specifically? Just a little bit of background on the plebeians of Rome. So the plebeians were Rome's working class, and they had little individual power themselves. But when grouped together, they had the power of the mob and had to be handled carefully by politicians. They comprised a formal class by the 1st century AD and had its own meetings, elected its own officials, and kept its own records. So the term plebeian refers to all free Roman citizens who were not members of the senatorial, equestrian, or patrician classes. These were average working citizens of Rome, bakers, farmers, builders, or craftsmen, and there were forms of public welfare that were established to supply for them as part of social good, but also to appease them. And this was done by Titus and Trajan, and in difficult times, plebeians could ask Roman administrators for help. The Emperor Augustus was aware of the need to keep plebeians pacified and well-fed enough so they wouldn't riot. He began a system of what some called state bribery, where free grain and controlled food prices meant that plebeians could not starve, and free entertainment, such as chariot races and gladiators in amphitheaters and the Circus Maximus, meant that they would not get bored and restless. Now, to return to the question of what did entertainment do to the Romans, the classical view is that it led to their degradation and downfall. Now, this is a tricky question because these free games are in Rome, and yes, it is the population center of the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire was, of course, vast, and like any pre-modern state, much of its population was in rural areas, and they couldn't take advantage of the Circus Maximus or these other games. So while these policies might have had an effect on the population of the city of Rome itself, how much did it really affect the empire as a whole? Well, to answer this question, as I am not a specialist on the Roman Empire, I'd like to turn to Ben Muriel. Admiral Ben Muriel, who passed away in 1978, was the chief of the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks and of the Civil Engineer Corps. And he's known as the father of the Navy's Seabees, construction battalions. He was also a fan of ancient history, and he wrote an article about this very topic, which I think is quite fascinating because he's combining his understanding of public policy with his own work in the military and classical education. What he would say that what did entertainment do to the Romans makes true the observation by the late President Lowell of Harvard University that no society is ever murdered, it commits suicide. Here's why. This social welfare and social entertainment led to a high tax rate required by subsidies, discouraged the entrepreneur with risk capital, which in turn favored the well-established, complacently prosperous businessman. What it led to was Rome being sacked by Alaric and his Goths in 410. But long before the barbarian invasions, Rome was a hollow shell of the once noble republic. Its real grandeur was gone and its people were demoralized. Most of the old forms and institutions remained, but a people whose horizons were limited by bread and circuses had destroyed the spirit while paying lip service to the letter of their once hollow traditions. So he argues the evil was not in bread and circuses themselves, because harvest festivals have been a part of civilization since they arose in Sumeria, basically, but in the willingness of the people to sell their rights as free men for full bellies and the excitement of games which would serve to distract them from other human hungers which bread and circuses can never appease. The moral decay of the people was not caused by the doles in the games, they merely provided a measure of their degradation. And the things that were originally good had become distorted, and as Shakespeare says, lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. Well, Liam, that is a short of what did entertainment do to the Romans. Some would say it led to their downfall. Well, thank you so much for the question. If any of you would like to submit one to me, you can do so by going to historyunpluggedpodcast.com. There you can submit a question to me, and you can also find instructions on how to review this podcast on iTunes. And I would like to thank the wonderful listeners who have left reviews on iTunes, and just read off a few of the ones that I really liked. One, by the handle The Monday American, says, "It's a good listen. He chooses historical topics that are engaging and interesting to listen to." And another one by Lex says that even if you aren't a history lover, you'll enjoy History Unplugged, great host, subject matter, and the shorter questions in between that are a quick listen. Well, thank you so much for those, and if you would like to submit one, whether you give it a great review or poor, I'm always happy to hear your feedback. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get your daily dose of all things history related, from ancient Greece to the Cold War. You can do that by going to historyonthenet.com/subscribe. Speaking of history on the net, if you want to dive deeper, go to our site historyonthenet.com, and there you'll find blog posts, book reviews, and all of our other podcast episodes. Plus, don't forget to rate and review this podcast so we can bring you the best daily history content possible. We'll see you next time at the History Unplugged podcast.